Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Marlene Brisk, and I'm a member of New Albany City Council. I'm going to begin with a little bit of a personal family history. In September of 1939, my father, who was 20 years old and living in a small farming village in Poland, was taken from his house by Nazi soldiers and shipped off to various ghettos, labor camps, and concentration camps until he was finally freed by Allied soldiers who broke down the walls of the Buchenwald concentration camp on April 11, 1945. He was 5'10" and he weighed 80 pounds. He had been the oldest of 9 children when he was taken from his home, and he went back to his hometown to see if any of his relatives were still there, and he found only one living relative. One sibling had survived. Also in September of 1939, my mother was taken from her home in a town called Tarnów, Poland. It was a few weeks after her 13th birthday. She endured a very similar experience to my father's: starvation, forced labor, beatings, and constant pain, fear, and loss. In April of 1945, she was taken from the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in a cattle car filled with a few thousand starving, near-death Jewish prisoners and shipped off to an unknown destination. The train was bombed by Allied forces, and she was able to escape the ruins and hide until help arrived. She was the youngest of 8 children, and she too found only one living relative when the war was over. In 1939, it is estimated that close to 9.5 million Jews lived in Europe. When the Nazis were defeated in 1945, the estimate is that there were 3.5 million Jews still alive. For some perspective, it is estimated that the entire Jewish population of the United States currently is approximately 8 million. And the vast majority of the survivors had experienced horrors we cannot imagine and were very close to death themselves. Very few of those survivors remain alive today, and less people know someone who was directly affected by this terrible period in our history. There are many who choose to believe that the truth is a huge exaggeration, and who can blame them? The extent of the systematic inhuman treatment of not just Jews, but many others that the Nazi Party felt were a threat to their power is hard to comprehend. There is a very real danger when we allow ourselves to minimize the humanity of those different from us in our hearts and in our minds. It is very easy to fall down the slippery slope that leads us from ignorance to indifference to collaboration and even support regarding the inhumane treatment of people we know nothing about. But the good news is that we all have the power to make a huge difference by simply choosing to do the right thing when the opportunity presents itself. On April 13, 1945, after many years of ignorance, indifference, and collaboration by many around the world, 2,500 Jewish prisoners of war on an abandoned train near Magdeburg, Germany, had the good fortune to be found by a small group of young men from the 30th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. Those prisoners left the same concentration camp as my mother within days of my mother, but thanks to these young men, they did not get bombed by Allied fire, and they did not remain abandoned and left to hide and starve to death while they hoped someone would be kind enough to help them. Instead, these young men stopped marching forward in battle and helped these strangers survive. We all have these opportunities in our lives, the moments when we say we are going to take a step toward helping others rather than ignoring or adding to their pain. It is my hope that we will all leave here tonight looking for those opportunities and acting on them, setting examples for our children and our peers. I am extremely grateful to our Mayor, Sloan Spalding, and to my fellow City Council members for your unwavering support of this project and many others that we have instituted in our city in order to assure all people within our community feel welcome and valued. Thank you to our amazing city staff for putting so much of your time and talent into making events like this a success. I knew I could sell all the tickets. They were free. And finally, I want to say thank you to Mike Edwards for recognizing the importance of telling this story. Mike, can you come out? Mike, it has been such an honor to get to know you. You're an incredible human being, and he's also an incredible documentarian. Mike has won 14 Emmys for his films. He and his many supporters have worked tirelessly for close to 10 years to capture the testimony of those who witnessed the story we're about to discuss. And he continues working every day to get this film completed and hopefully distributed by a major streaming network in the very near future. It's an important story, and I am very, very honored to see you working so hard to make it happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for all you do, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Well, good evening. I'm Mike Edwards, a documentary filmmaker based here in Columbus, Ohio, and director of this series through my production company, the Five Stones Group. I also work alongside the Augusta Shiwi Foundation, also located here in Columbus, who is the producer of this incredible story. It's a profound honor to stand before you and share a train near Magdeburg. My journey with this story began 10 years ago, rooted in a passion for World War II history shaped by my family. My grandfather, a P-38 Lightning Squadron communications officer in the 428th Fighter Group, earned 4 Bronze Stars, and my grandmother served as a Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy in the Waves. In 2015, I produced an Emmy Award-winning documentary called Searching for Augusta, inspired by a story from the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers. I thought it was my final dive into history, until my cousin, a military historian and author, himself changed everything. He urged me to meet with retired Army First Lieutenant Frank Towers in Florida, who had briefly mentioned to him about a Nazi death train near Magdeburg. With David's support, I boarded a plane and had no idea what awaited me, only a nagging sense that something monumental was about ready to unfold. In a quiet Florida dining room over peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, Frank and I spoke for 4 hours. His voice carried me from the Normandy's beaches to Europe's war-torn heart, until he paused, his steel gray eyes glistening. "There was a train," he said, "near Magdeburg, a Nazi death train." The words hit me like a thunderbolt. My pulse raced as he described the skeletal figures emerging from the cars. A photograph that captured their liberation and the weight of that moment in history had nearly been forgotten and was taken. I sat transfixed, and my eyes welling, my mind racing with questions where that photograph could be that many now consider to be one of the most powerful photographs of the 20th century. Could I see it? As our time ended, I asked, "Frank, what's your takeaway after all these years?" He leaned forward, his voice steady but heavy. "Never treat anyone without kindness. Every person deserves respect as a human being." In that moment, my purpose as a filmmaker crystallized. This story had to be told. As I packed up my camera, still reeling, Frank stopped me. With quiet intensity, he pressed a slip of paper into my hand, a phone number for Matt Roselle, a teacher in upstate New York. "He has a part to play in this story," Frank said, his voice carrying with it the weight of something big. "Call him." So back home, I dialed Matt's number, and I got his voicemail. I left a halting message, unsure if he'd call me back. Days turned into weeks, and my hope fading, until my phone rang. Hudson Falls, New York. Matt's calm voice invited me to visit him, promising to share the full scope of this story, including the photograph Frank described. I packed my bags again, drawn by a force I couldn't name, ready to uncover a truth that demanded to be heard. Today, we're joined by an extraordinary panel. Matt Rosell, who discovered and preserved this history and is the author of the best-selling book, A Train Near Magdeburg. Elizabeth Conley, whose father's account sparked its rediscovery. Dr. Mika Tomkowitz, a child survivor from that train. And Johanna Muck, a young German who as a high school student learned that this event took place near her own hometown and has dedicated her life to honoring this story. Thank you for being here this evening and for bearing witness to this story of resilience, compassion, and remembrance. Let's take a look at the trailer for the documentary film, and then we'll move to our panel discussion. Welcome to the unbelievable true story of a train near Magdeburg.
We were put into unbelievable conditions in freight cars.
Everybody felt that this is a place where they're gonna come and kill us all.
The commander decided he's going to execute by machine gun fire those 2,500 skeletons of us who were on the train.
Then I saw the soldiers, and they were beautiful.
2,500 people dumped in your lap, what are you gonna do?
They were in the midst of fighting a war.
I heard a story, and by being interested in the story, something happened to me.
Did you mention the train at all?
I saw somebody who came and saved me.
My parents never knew about this.
And I thought, how is he gonna do this?
Matt, you better get your secretaries ready for what's gonna come, because I think this story is gonna go viral.
You know, this could be really big.
I remember asking him who those people were in the pictures.
I mean, I was in a state of shock.
Welcome, everybody. It's good to see all of you. Matt, why don't we start off the panel discussion with you? First question. Can you share how you first learned about the train near Magdeburg through your interviews with veterans like Red Walsh, and what initially drew you to pursue this story further?
Thank you, Michael. I think, first of all, I want to say thank you to the New Albany community. My wife, who you just saw in the video, my 3 children are here in the audience as well. We hail from north of Albany, New York, so I think we're kindred spirits here. On the Hudson River, I taught at a small high school, Hudson Falls High School in upstate New York. I actually was a student there. I graduated in 1979, I believe it was. And I told my father, who actually taught history in the town across the river in Glens Falls, when he asked, "What do you want to do with your life, son?" He picked me up from school one day when I was a senior. I said, "I don't know, Dad, but I want to get out of Hudson Falls, and I sure don't want to be a teacher." And I kind of meant it, but I was also kind of twisting the knife a little bit into the old man. I think I hurt him a little bit. I went off to school at SUNY Geneseo in the western part of New York State, and that's where I met my wife, Laura, who's from Long Island, actually. And I didn't know what to do with my life, really, is what it came down to. I did like history. I took a lot of history classes, and I thought maybe I'd be a lawyer. Figured it out by the time I was a senior in college, right? And it didn't work out that way. I took a pre-law class, and I hated it. So I bit the bullet, and I actually went back to school after I got my undergraduate degree in history, and to become a teacher like the old man. And 7 years later, I was living under his roof, his garage actually in the back, driving his hand-me-down Delta 88 Oldsmobile 2 miles up the street to my old high school, where I was now on the other side of the desk. trying to survive in a classroom where that particular year, I think it was 87, I was the third teacher that these kids had. They're bad. Ninth graders who they basically drove the other poor two teachers out before Thanksgiving. So they just wanted a body in the classroom. And I managed to survive that year. And when I came back the following fall, I remember being crestfallen when I saw my student list. And some of the same criminals who were ninth graders were on my 10th grade list, but I beat them. And I survived, and I became their class advisor. And we kind of hit it off after that. So to get to the answer to the question and why you're all in the room here tonight is not to hear my life story, but it's a big part of how this all came together and the so many miracles of this story that led to the book, A Train Near Magdeburg, and the liberation of this train being recalled by the survivors. Now the second generation, the liberating soldiers and their children, it's united people worldwide. And I'm so happy that Mike's had the opportunity to work. I've had the opportunity to work with him for the past, we're going on, I think, 9 years now. You know, since he went down, he called me up and went down and visited Frank Towers. We've been working together on this project, so we're thankful to this community for supporting us. But back to the story and how it really unfolded. I was tasked with teaching world history to 14 and 15-year-olds who had to take a state exam at the end of their 10th grade year. So it was a 2-year course, basically. And it was my job to get them through the Regents exam in New York State. We had to do 8,000 years of world history in literally in 2 years of 35-minute classes, 180 days a year. You whittle out all the vacation time, snow days and all that stuff. There's not a lot of time to really go deep into a subject. But when we got to the spring of their sophomore year, that's when I slowed down, and I was very interested to learn about the experience of World War II soldiers. And a lot of it had to do with when I came out of college in the mid-1980s, 1984 to be exact. There was some hoopla surrounding the fact that American GIs, veterans of the Normandy D-Day landings, were returning to Normandy for the 40th anniversary ceremony. Now, you have to remember this, and you probably already know this. Probably everybody in the room can remember a World War II veteran in their life. These guys really didn't talk about the war when they got home. 16 million men and women put on the uniform of the United States Army. Many of them did go overseas and see combat. When they got home, the war was over, they needed to get on with their lives, okay? The baby boom started, and they did, and they prospered, but they didn't talk about it with their families. Wives had no idea what their husbands were screaming about in the middle of the night. Just wake them up gently if you can. Children, they suffered through their father's trauma in other ways, and I've heard this from many people because I've written actually 11 books besides this one about the World War II generation, the oral history, the story of World War II in their own words. They just didn't talk about it. So when they went back to Normandy in '84, the American president greeted them at Pointe du Hoc. He gave a nice speech there. They went to the cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. I was really moved and I was touched. And the thing about it, and people ask me this question a lot. I'm a World War II author, interviewed a lot of guys. Matt, what was was your father in World War II? The answer is no. He was in the Korean War, though. It was comic books. It was Sergeant Rock and Easy Company. When I was in junior high school, it was my escape, right? But getting back to the story here. I began to ask my students, I stopped in May of every year, and I said, we're going to slow down, and we're going to talk a little bit about this thing called World War II. We're going to spend more than 3 class periods on it. And I asked my students, how many of you in this classroom have somebody in your family who was in World War II? Now, I asked this question. I taught 4 classes this morning to the young people of this community, Beautiful kids, by the way. I had one hand was raised in 4 classes, a couple hundred kids. Somebody who actually knew somebody who was in the World War II generation who was still alive. Back then, every single hand went up in my classroom. 2 hands went up. Their grandparents were in the war, and in some cases, their parents. And I said, you know, this is really cool. I wonder what the stories are. So I created a 2-page survey, really simple. Your name, rank, and serial number kind of thing. What branch of the service were you in? Did you see combat? Where were you? What did you do? What was your experience? And I bribed the kids with extra credit, you know. I really, it's kind of selfish. I wanted to see what was out there. And when they came back in, I got a lot of responses. They were incredible stories within a 5-mile radius of our high school. So I began to invite the veterans in, and instead of instead of reading about World War II in their boring history book, or listening to me, although I was a pretty good storyteller, they got to hear the history from the guys who were there. And I smartened up. I got a video camera. We started to tape them. I put my kids to work. Again, I probably bribed them with extra credit, and I had them type out the transcriptions. And when the internet was born in the late 90s, you know, technology was the big thing in high schools. They wanted all the teachers to adopt it. I started a World War II Living History Project page. So we put these interviews up on our World War II Living History Project website. I had probably 20 stories, really cool stories from all aspects of the war. And in the summer of 2001, and I'm getting to the point now, don't worry about it. The summer of 2001, I went to pick up my children from daycare. Our 3 children were very little now. They're not anymore, but a fellow parent was there to pick up his son, and he had heard about me because I was in the newspaper a little bit, soliciting, you know, hey, if you're a World War II veteran, come talk to me in the classroom kind of thing. And he said, you got to talk to my father-in-law. He was a tank commander in World War II. He fought all kinds of combat across Normandy. He actually landed a month after D-Day, the 30th Infantry Division, at Omaha Beach, and they fought across France. They liberated Normandy. They were actually the first unit to take a German city, the city of Aachen, in October of 1944, really hard fighting. And then Hitler's great counteroffensive at the Battle of the Bulge began, and they had to go back down into Belgium and France, and it was brutal. It was brutal stuff. 19,000 American boys died in that 6-week battle. So he's telling me these stories. I went over to the house of the mother of actually one of my older students, Sean Conley. It was Elizabeth, who's sitting here today. I unpacked my camera. I hit it off with this guy. His name was Red Walsh, and you saw him in the video clip. He's sitting in the rocking chair. He was 80 years old, a retired New York State Supreme Court Justice. And what Red did was, when I look back at that interview now, it's a lot of back and forth conversation. It's not a real interview, it's a conversation. And he really enjoyed talking to me because we read Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation. We critiqued it together in the interview. What do you think about Saving Private Ryan? You know, you were there a month after D-Day kind of thing. And we had a really good conversation. For 2 hours, he's telling me stories of combat. He's telling me funny stories. He loved to laugh. I remember him slapping his knee, talking about the pranks they would pull, you know, in times of boredom. But there were also times of sheer terror. And, you know, he brought me right to the end of the war, and they were shipping home. You know, they'd already crossed the Rhine River into Germany. And, you know, 2 hours is a long time to talk for anybody. And it was time to go. So we kind of wrapped the interview up, and I let Elizabeth know that I was leaving. And I think something in her said, no, you're not done yet. And she'll tell you about this, but she said, Dad, did you tell Mr. Rozelle about that train? I think it was in the trailer here. And what? Oh, no, he didn't. He was called out of a tank column with their major of the 743rd Tank Battalion, which was attached to the 30th Infantry Division. I think it was 20 tanks in Company D. He said, Tank 12, Tank 13, you guys come with me, follow me, I'll be in the Jeep. We're gonna go down and see what this train is doing installed by these tracks near the Elbe River, about 15 kilometers from the city of Magdeburg. That was to be their final battle. You have to remember the Russian Red Army is closing in from the east. Nazi Germany is collapsing, but they're still fighting hard. That city of Magdeburg just didn't throw out the white flags. A lot of these guys were going to be killed in the next few days. But these two tanks were pulled out to see what the heck is going on with this train that's right in the way. And more than just the abandoned train, like 40 or 50, 60 boxcars, there were distressed civilians in the vicinity, and they were in the way. And what's going on here? So he talked about pulling his tank up alongside the train, peering into one of the boxcars, but Major Benjamin, as they were pulling up, snapped the photograph that no one in the world had seen for 80 years. It was buried in the National Archives. Clarence Benjamin took that photograph. And when I was talking to Carol, he said, you need to talk to my friend George Gross. He was in the other tank. He was a retired English literature professor in California, and he had a camera that day, and he took pictures. So as Mike has mentioned before, you know, when we see pictures of the Holocaust and we see photographs of trains in Nazi Germany or heading towards Auschwitz or wherever, these are not happy photographs. They are people being deported to their death. But these photographs that involve a train show the complete opposite. These are people who were saved. And these photographs of these liberated people are very joyous. And you can see some of them in the book. Gross had like 10 or 11 photographs that he shot that day. And the reason Walsh, it almost slipped his mind, again, I was distracting him in this conversation the whole time. Maybe I wasn't interviewing very well. We were having a good time, don't get me wrong, but he was there for an hour, and he had to go on to fight the battle. And Gross's tank was there overnight. So he got to actually meet these people. He got the name of many of them, and he had a girl. Her name was Gina Rappaport, who was a survivor, maybe 26 or 27 from the Krakow ghetto, and she spoke 7 languages. And this train, what's so important about this story is it's a microcosm of what happened during the Holocaust. So the story that we're telling interviews many survivors, one of whom is sitting right next to me here today, Dr. Mika Tomkowitz. You had Polish survivors, Hungarian survivors, you had Dutch Jews, you had German Jews, you even had Greek Jews on this train. And it's just a totally amazing story once we got to the bottom of it. But she was the translator for George Gross. And he took her name down, and they corresponded a little bit after the war. She made it to Palestine/Israel. And the beauty of this thing is all this stuff was going to be flash forwarding into the future. So I got the story. I talked to George Gross. I got the photographs. He gave me permission to put them on our school website. They sat there for 4 years. And in 2006, I got an email from a grandmother in Australia who'd been a 7-year-old Dutch girl on the train. And I remember being floored. She called George Gross. She managed to find him in the phone book in San Diego. And he was watching the news. He told me this. It's in the book, his account of the phone call, when this girl who had been on the train called him out of the blue. He was yelling at the TV set because the news was on, and he didn't like what he was seeing on the news. He was kind of like the grumpy old man kind of thing here. And he shouted into the phone when it interrupted him. He called it the intruding instrument in his beautiful English prose. I picked up the intruding instrument and I yelled, "What do you want?" And he heard a meek voice on the other end of the phone. He said, "Is this George Gross?" And he knew he had to settle down. And he said, "Yes." "Were you in World War II, and did you have anything to do with a train that was liberated near Magdeburg, Germany in 1945? And she cried for the next 7 or 8 minutes. So I got the email from her, and it knocked me out of my chair. And shortly thereafter, I heard from 3 other male survivors, and we organized a reunion. They came up to Hudson Falls High School, and they got to meet Red Walsh. George Gross, he wasn't feeling well. He didn't travel from California at the time. But it was a beautiful meeting we had. And to get to the end of my part here, the Associated Press picked up the story because I knew somebody in Albany, New York, who worked in the office there. And he said, Matt, get your secretaries ready because the story might go viral. And it did. It went all over the world. And this is before social media, really. And before the end of the month was out, I heard from 60 other people who had been children on this train. There were over 700 kids on this train. And I heard from Lieutenant Frank Towers, who Mike opened with here. Frank was the one who saw this in the paper. He wrote to me and he said, I think I know about this story because I was the guy who was tasked with bringing these people out of harm's way when the tanks had to go on and fight the battle the next day. And he did. He brought them to the base at Hillersleben, which was a German military base that was actually taken by the Americans the same day, maybe 12 or 14 kilometers away. We have the historian of Hillersleben in the audience tonight. I hope you get a chance to meet him and talk to him. But the bottom line is, Frank began to keep a list, and Frank was the one working with a survivor's daughter, Varda Weisskopf, in Israel, who compiled a list of over 300 people that we have since found on this train, okay? Now, this is before I met Michael Edwards 10 years ago. So I knew there was a book there. I knew I had a story to tell, and I went on to work with the good folks at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I studied at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial. I actually got to tour for 3 weeks the camps with fellow educators, with Holocaust experts, and we went to Bergen-Belsen. We went to Bergen-Belsen on July 5th, 2013, and it was a day that Elizabeth's dad, Red Walsh, my hero, was being laid into the ground back in Johnstown, New York. I couldn't be there, but I was at Bergen-Belsen. So I was seeing the story with my own eyes. So I went on this journey about the Holocaust, and I learned that the more you learn about the Holocaust, and don't forget, I'm somebody who's supposed to be teaching it to my students. I realize how much I don't know. So writing the book was a great experience for me. I had a lot of revelations along the way, and I hope you can pick it up someday, but getting back to Michael's next question here. It's been a very profound journey for me, and I know I'll probably get asked another question before the night's over, but Mike, I'm going to have you ask your next question. I'm sorry to ramble on, but
Sure.
I get really emotional about this stuff.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for being a brave teacher who went ahead and did what he thought was right to teach your students. And this story would not exist without Matt Roselle. So. Elizabeth, let's move on to you. Your father, Red Walsh, was one of the tank commanders who liberated the train. What did he share with you about that day? And how did encouraging him to tell Matt about it affect him and your family?
So Matt talked about 2001, but if you go back to be like 1965, 1964, I was a young girl, and my dad used to have lead soldiers that he had in his dresser drawer, and I loved to play with. And I would go in there, and I discovered the pictures that they were talking about, and they fascinated me. I realized that they didn't look like any of our relatives, and so when I asked him about them, he was like, oh, it was a train that we came upon near the end of the war. And as Matt mentioned, back then they didn't talk a lot of detail about anything. And so now fast forward to 2001, and he mentioned my son Sean had been in one of his classes. My husband, Tim, had talked to him about getting my father to talk, but my dad was like, I don't have anything to say. I don't know why you want me to talk to him. There's nothing to talk about. And we just kept encouraging him. So as Matt said, 2 hours later, you know, and then, but he still never mentioned the train. And I think the reason I mentioned the train was because those pictures fascinated me, especially the pictures that's on the cover of Matt's book. That was the one that always drew me to it. And so as he talked to Matt and he started to talk more about what had happened, you know, he talked about how they came upon this train, Dr. Gross in his tank, Major Benjamin. And when they came upon this train, they had no idea what was or who was in this train. They thought it was empty at first. And then as he rode by, he realized that there were all people that were smushed in these boxcars. And it was a long line of these boxcars. And when they finally opened it up, they found people that were emaciated, sick, had lice all over them. They had been traveling in this train up and down the train track for 6 days. And so those were the stories that finally came out and he talked more about. And then out of this, you have to realize these soldiers were young men. My father was probably one of the oldest ones. He was 24 years old. Can you imagine thinking of your child at 24 years old encountering this? When I think of mine, I can't. But here was my dad at 24 and the younger soldiers. They saw a sight that they never thought that they would see. What humans could do to other humans. So taking that from there, and I'm going to stop so that we can go on, but you have to understand that that came out of fear, out of ignorance, and out of hatred and bigotry. And I think it's very important for us to realize how that happened so that we can prevent it from happening again.
Absolutely. As Matt stated in his comments, there have been 11 reunions on 3 continents due to Matt Rozelle. It's the largest reunification of Holocaust survivors and U.S. liberators in history. So Dr. Topkowitz, we're so honored that you're here with us tonight. Talking about the reunions, when you met Carol Walsh for the first time, your liberator, 63 years later, who you probably thought you'd never see again, what was that like for you, meeting Carol Walsh at the high school? How did you feel and what was that like?
This was great, and I will get into the details, but let me tell you first, basically, the story that led me to meet Carol Walsh. It started for me, obviously it started for me in 1939 when I was born. I was born to a Jewish family in Warsaw 3 months after before the German invasion into Poland. The first 3 years of my life were spent in the ghetto and through some exercises, some time in the house of an Aryan Christian lady outside the ghetto to hide me. Then came basically effort by the Germans to save many Germans that actually resided in sort of hostile countries, but they were not directly involved in the war. And an exchange program is being devised. Now, The exchange program was simple. We let X number of Jews to go to a safe place. You protect our guys in the countries the Germans were in. Fine. The negotiation, who is going where, took place in a Hotel Polski, which is a hotel in Warsaw. After some adventures, my mother decided to apply. She was rejected. It turned out that this was immediately after the ghetto uprising. It turned out that my father and my uncles, etc., were basically put before that on the train to Treblinka. And on the way, my father, my two uncles, wife, etc., jumped from the train. My father was killed on the spot. One uncle and his wife basically managed to get into a Polish village that gave them up to the Nazis, and they were killed. My younger uncle actually made it to Warsaw, met my mother, told her the story. And my mother applied, and the guy that was in charge, actually, of the list was the guy that jumped with them from the tram to Treblinka for reasons which are beyond that. So we ended on the list, and as time went on, instead of taking us to safe countries, we were taken to Bergen-Belsen. This was July '43. Now, we got into Bergen-Belsen, and my mother, after a while, basically, Bergen-Belsen for us at least was for concentration camp a reasonable place. But as time went on, things changed, and Bergen-Belsen became actually a murdering place for one of them. And then in April 13, 1945, the German basically transported us from Bergen-Belsen to the Theresienstadt, another camp near Prague that fundamentally was far away from the front line. In the middle, during the train, it was very close in terms of date to the time where basically the end of the Second World War. The train was intercepted by the 30th Division, by the American Army, and we have this event here to sort of memorize the event. Now, after that, Jewish Agency took us to Palestine, which became Israel, and I went through normal schools, university, got my PhD, like everybody else in the world. Made a career, took a postdoc to the United States, completely boycotted Germany unless I had to pass through airports or something like that. Well, 1990, things changed. German unified. East German, West German became Germany. And throughout the scientific community, including myself, things changed very quickly. 2002, key time. My professional organization decided to make a meeting in Berlin. So I decided, finished with the boycott, finished that Germany is a normal country right now, usual country. I went to that and I said, hey, if you finish the boycott, you might finish it all the way. Okay? So in addition to the professional meeting in Berlin, me and my wife went to Bergen-Belsen. In Bergen-Belsen, I gave an interview, chat, stuff, etc. But almost the first question that I asked the guys there is, where is Hillersleben? Because I still remember that April 13, the Americans liberated us and took us to Hillersleben. The guy in Bergen-Belsen laughed and said, okay, we'll take you there. Okay, I completely didn't realize that it takes 2.5 hours to drive from Bergen-Belsen to Hillersleben, which actually was Farsleben later on. So 2 guys from Bergen-Belsen, and we have still pictures of them, took and showed me the terrain. And that was it. Okay, after that, I returned to the United States and continue my usual stuff. Suddenly, early 2007, I'm getting an email from Bergen-Belsen. Please look at this link. So we look at the link, and we found Matt Rosel's communication. I forgot if it was blog or not blog, etc. We find the issue. Okay. I immediately told Matt our story, and Memorial Day was approaching, and we took the trip to San Diego to meet George Gross. His son is sitting, at least last I saw, there. And we had a wonderful, wonderful Memorial Day in George Gross' life, etc. Few months later, Matt organized the meeting with one liberator, Carl, okay, Red Walsh, and 3 survivors, 500 shouting students. And they were allowed to ask questions. And some of the questions were superb, because they allowed connections that otherwise you couldn't think. Now, for me, it was great on a number of levels. I obviously at that time knew exactly the stories. My mother wrote the books about it, started to write them, that I brought with me if you want to see them, and started to write when she was in the camp, and then when we went to Palestine, the British guy who was her employer let her continue to write them. First was the book in Polish about life in Bergen-Belsen. Then from there, she went into what was life in Warsaw before Bergen-Belsen, and then a historian, Schumacher, basically wrote the whole book about Hotel Polski. Now, I knew the story, but I knew the shell of the story. It means American armies saved us, okay? It's not personal, okay? Suddenly, in Matrum, we had a face, one face, okay? We saw each other, and immediately on mutual say, long time no see. Okay? Now, the point was of that particular meeting that Matt was superb sort of publisher of this kind of an effort, the significance of this effort. I don't remember exactly how long it took, but almost immediately we started to get really sharp anti-Semitic literature that this cannot be true, we are not wearing as a prisoner, it's all false. So we wanted to reply, but both George Gross and Carol said, let's not
Let it go.
enlarge the issue and just ignore it. And we listen and we ignore it. Okay, and my connection, and more than that, when Frank Towers actually got into the equation, it was not one liberator, but it was a whole group of liberators, okay? And now we started to be buddies. And we started to talk, and the most important talk to me at least, was that 2 or 3 of the liberators said, hey, now we listen to these stories, we understand why we actually were fighting the war. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor. Johanna, growing up in Germany near the site of the liberation, how did you first learn about this event as a high school student? How did you feel when you learned about it? And what motivated you to start sharing it with your community?
I first learned about the story of the train when my then history teacher, Karin Petersen, told us about it. I was in 10th grade. I grew up just about 2 miles away from the liberation site, and I had never heard about it before. And neither had my history teacher. She had gone to a presentation given by a local historian, and they knew about the story and they talked about it. And she had been a history teacher at the school, like, as I said, 2 miles away from the liberation site for 25, 30 years, and she had never heard about it before. And she was shocked, and so was I, really. And I remember when she told us about the story, she had Matt's book there with that famous picture on the cover, and she showed us that picture, and she pretty much described it the same way Matt just did. She said that all the other pictures of the Holocaust are really sad and depict that tragedy, obviously, but this picture is a picture of happiness, of life, of freedom, and that was really what drew me to this story and what I found so fascinating about it, and which is why I wanted to learn more about it. And essentially my teacher encouraged me to reach out to Matt, and I did, and he gave me the address of a medic who was at the hospital in Hillersleben. His name was Walter Gans. And he helped to care for the patients there that were liberated on the train. And I wrote a letter to him, several letters actually, and he wrote back and he told me what he had seen. And it was just, he was an incredible person, and I wish I could have met him. And the things he told me just stuck with me, and so I couldn't let the story go, really. And he was just one of those eyewitnesses, I guess, that you just had to know and you just had to listen to. And my teacher always told us that history, you know, was alive and you had to talk to eyewitnesses and stuff, but I wasn't really listening to that until this story came about and I actually realized what she was talking about. And yes, so I found the story fascinating from the start, and I wanted to get involved with it. And me and a couple of other students, we did that, and we started a sort of project group together with our teacher. And we started to raise money for a monument, because at the liberation site, there was nothing there. There were the train tracks, and otherwise there was just grass. And yeah, we raised money. We organized some events to do that. We organized 2 events with Micha and also with another survivor, Peter Lantosh, at our school. They talked to the students there, and they also talked to the public, and we wanted to really raise awareness to the story because it happened in our region and no one really knew about it. And it was very important to us that everybody got to know this story, because it's a story of hope and of freedom and of love and kindness, and we really wanted to share that with everyone.
That's great. Dr. Yeah. Dr. Tomkowitz, question for you, just following up on that. You got to go to Johanna's high school, in Germany, right?
Oh, yeah.
And would you?
I lost my hearing, so you have to.
Talked about the high school. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay.
Tell me briefly, what did you feel when you were invited back to Germany and were interacting with Johanna and these students? How did you feel?
Excellent question. Told you before how we ended up in Germany, that basically the two guys from Bergen-Belsen took us because I asked, where is Hillersleben? Okay. Now, starting from that, we made friends in Farsleben, and the friendship mostly focused on building a monument. Okay, so this was not only visit, but this was correspondence with a whole bunch of people that great. Among the people were Joanna, that we'll put later on, but Annette, that was director of, that is director of the museum, not in Farsleben, but outside Farsleben, that all. And Karen, that was teacher in the school. And this all basically focused on what kind of monument actually to start. And I was there, other people from other places were there, etc. Then among the correspondents came my suggestion, basically, hey, I can come to the high school and basically talk, because by that time I had some experience in talking to high school outside Germany. So this was arranged, and the whole talk was in English. Joanna didn't even need to translate the talk because all the Germans understood the talk as they are. But my friendship actually with Farsleben, with Hillersleben, we have Daniel lives in Hillersleben, that is dear friend that we meet every time that we go there. Basically still on, sustained, and the benefit at least of me.
That's great. Matt, would you briefly describe how do you see this story fitting into modern Holocaust education, particularly for younger generations?
Well, Mike, this is a story that's evolved over the past 24 years since I first sat down with Carol, and we became great friends. He passed in 2012. George Gross passed a year before in 2011. Frank Towers actually passed in 2016 when I was studying at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. On July 4th, he was 99 years old. So out of my 3 or 4 good Holocaust liberator friends, Walter Gantz was the only one who was left. And a few years later, Johanna wrote to me as a 16-year-old, and she wanted a pen pal. She wanted a liberator to correspond with. And I hooked her up with Walter, and he agreed, and he hand wrote beautiful cursive handwriting, multi-page letters. And Johanna would write him back. You know, he's not doing the email thing. The others did. But Walter, he was old school. And Walter's story is a little bit different because he didn't come to any of the reunions at the high school because he learned about me, actually, is how we connected. After our final high school reunion in 2011, we did 3 of them at the high school, 2 years apart. You have to remember, these people are getting older. It's harder for them to travel. He called me up like a month after the last one, in our high school anyway, and I answered the phone in my classroom. My school district put an outside line the direct line in my classroom because the secretaries were getting calls from all over the world by this point. And it saved time, although the secretaries were vital to this project and they loved being a part of it. And I can't give them enough credit for making things happen. But Walter, I was in the study hall. I had a couple of kids in the room. Phone rang. I answered it. Hello. Matt Roselle, God bless you. That's the way he answered the phone all the time. And his family's here tonight. God bless you for coming. In Walter's memory, but this guy said, Matt, I was at Hillersleben. We were with the 95th Medical Gas Battalion. I remember a lot. He was with these people for 6 weeks. He was trying to save their lives. Ariella Rojic, whose daughter is in the audience today with her husband from Toronto. She was from Poland. She remembered, well, he remembered her because she tried to jump out of a window as an 11-year-old with the typhus. She was just crazed with fever. And, you know, the medics helped to save these people. But where I'm going with this Walter said, whenever we talked about Hillersleben, whenever we got together for our reunions, and they met 40 times after World War II, we never talked about Hillersleben, where they tried to nurse these people back to health. He said, I became known as a sharpshooter because I could find the veins in these emaciated arms to try and give them intravenous fluids, etc. He said these people were screaming. And there were German doctors and nurses who were actually taking care of them at this point too. And they were afraid. And Walter said it was just a really traumatic experience for him. He talked about a girl. Her name was Eva Klein. She was 15 years old. She weighed less than 80 pounds, I think, in the book, maybe 75. He told me in his testimony. Mike interviewed him in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he lived. And he told just how traumatized these poor guys were. And I do have some video of him talking on YouTube if you ever want to check him out, about how he went back to Bergen-Belsen. And we have another survivor in the audience, Michael will introduce him later, who actually came from Brooklyn to meet Walter at one of those events. And Walter they just hugged each other. It was a beautiful moment, but Walter was crying, and he was 95 years old recalling this event. Now, the thing, and I totally forgot what Mike's question was, but I'm gonna wrap it up very shortly here. The thing about this is, these guys, the traumatic experiences they had, this was very healing at the end of their lives to hear from these survivors, these people that they saved so long ago. And they developed, as Elizabeth would tell you, very close friendships, second generation, etc. Mike and I interviewed Walter in 2019, 95, strapping. He actually got to meet another survivor face to face. Very beautiful moment we have on film. And that's when he started to correspond with Johanna. He was dead by Thanksgiving. And that was kind of a shock. But Walter remembered carrying this girl, who I mentioned before, skin and bones, crying down to the morgue tent because she died in his arms, basically. And she's buried in a mass grave at Hillersleben. It was an air raid trench where these bodies were deposited. And they, I think there's over 130 people who were buried in this site in Hillersleben from the train. And Walter was there for 6 weeks. So, getting back to the story, he said, my parents couldn't understand when I got home why I cried at night, why I couldn't sleep. And he couldn't talk to them. He couldn't tell them this. But at the end of their lives, they had this moment of unity, this moment of healing. And this is a very important story because, unfortunately, we know the world we live in today, and maybe it's changed a lot since I was in the classroom. The anti-Semitism that we see growing on a daily basis is very alarming, especially for a Holocaust educator. It is, you wonder if your work's in vain. Now, I wrote this book, and I'll be honest, yeah, I've sold quite a few copies of it. It's not about the money, believe me, but it's about getting the story out there. But not enough people have heard this story. I know many of you who are in this room today weren't aware of this story before, you caught wind of it and came here tonight. But Mike's been working very hard on this project, and it's all about education. I have a colleague sitting in the front row here, Sarah Kohlbaum, who teaches in a small school in Illinois, who's working on the curriculum. I met her at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum when we were selected out of a pool of hundreds and hundreds of applicants to become museum teacher fellows. And it's our job to help educate the educators who are going to be teaching the Holocaust in the United States of America. So she's actually working on the curriculum for this project. Where should this go, and what should this do, and what is the legacy of what we're talking about here tonight? Well, the Holocaust is one of those things, and I may have mentioned it. This is my 5th time talking about it today, so I don't know if I already said this, but what you realize as a Holocaust educator, and Sarah will back me up on this 100%, she studied at Yad Vashem as well. The more you learn about this thing known as the Holocaust, the greatest crime in the history of the world, the more you realize you don't know. And maybe it's like that with many history topics, I don't know, but I liken it to walking into a room with 12 doors, and each door that you open leads to another room with 12 more doors. That's how deep you get into this. So to go back to your original question, Mike, this is a very important story because in the grand scheme of things, we talk about happily ever after. We have this 86-year-old young man sitting next to me today who was saved by these American soldiers. That's a happy ending story and what he did with his life afterwards. But for every one of the 2,500 people who were liberated and freed on this train, discounting the ones who may have passed away after liberation, but they died with the word freedom on their lips. I think that's an important thing too, because I've heard this from survivors about their grandfathers who passed away, knowing that they had been freed by the Americans. For every one of the 2,500 people freed on the train, 2,500 didn't survive this thing known as the Holocaust, if you're gonna go with the 6 million number as a reference point, okay? It's not a happy ever after story because these people still had to rebuild their lives. Most of them, I'm gonna say 99% of them, had no homes to return to. Mika and his mom made it to Palestine. The woman who first contacted me wound up in Australia from Holland, right? There's nothing to go back to in Poland. And what about Hungary? 420,000 people were deported to their deaths in 3 months in 1944. As D-Day is unfolding, most of Europe's Jews are already dead. And as Red Walsh pointed out many times, talking to our students, was and I don't want to steal your fire, but
No, you go ahead and say it.
he couldn't stand having people label him as a hero, as a liberator. He totally disliked it. He just loved to meet the people that he saved. Well, don't call me a savior, We were there, we were doing our jobs, but what he was really upset about was how could the world let this happen? In those years leading up to World War II, the Holocaust was already unfolding. It just ramped up.
As he would put it, the world turned their backs on these people.
Exactly.
It was the entire world. The entire world turned their backs.
And he was kind of mad about that.
Yes.
And he was mad when people put him on a pedestal. And I found that to be true of many of our American soldiers, these GIs. So I think the moral of the story is we cannot afford to forget the lessons of the past because the Holocaust began with words. And I think most of you in this audience know that on some level. You probably have some level of education on the Holocaust. How many people did Hitler kill with his own hands in World War II, right? None. He had an awful lot of help. So we have to look at that aspect too. but also look at the people who just turned away, the neighbors who turned away. You know, we know the stories of the people who hid Jewish families and the righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem and all that. That wasn't a lot of people in a lot of these countries, occupied or in Germany or wherever. So I think the lesson we need to take away from what these American soldiers did was they saw something that had to be, these people were in distress, they needed help. They needed to correct this situation, even though they didn't have to, which Mike will tell you. This is a lesson for all Americans.
Well, they had orders to continue.
Yeah.
It wasn't for Major Benjamin.
They had a war to fight. Their job was not to be humanitarians, but they stopped and they did their job. And because of that today, tens of thousands of people are alive today. So there is a profound lesson in this whole story, and it is still unfolding. We're still hearing from quote unquote new survivors, people who weren't aware of this story before, whose families were on the train, and we'll hear from more. But this is the story that we hope brings Americans together. It's a story of the power of love. It's the story of healing the world, these young men and what they did, even though their intention wasn't to be heroes or saviors or anything like that. They were just doing their jobs, and they suffered for it. They suffered all their lives. So, I mean, my one takeaway is seeing the reaction of the students interacting with the survivors and the liberating soldiers, and now the second generation. I take a lot of comfort in what I see in our young people. Once they're exposed to this story, they feel good about being American. And I think the whole story tells us what the power of love is, and we see it unfolding across time and space, across generations. And it's just an amazing thing to witness. And I get emotional when I think about, why me, you know? This kid from Hudson Falls who didn't even want to be a teacher, right? Who went off to college and said, I ain't never coming back here. Well, if I had gotten my wish and had gotten a job out in Western New York State, which I did, and I came in number 2 for it, I wound up back in my alma mater, the last place in the world I wanted to be. If I had gotten my wish back in 1980, whatever it was, nobody would be here in this room today. The world wouldn't know this story, I don't think. So yeah, it's, for me as an educator, I think it's really important. This is a story that's going to resonate not only with every American, really, who takes the time to watch the film. I think it's going to resonate worldwide, and I think it can go on to do great things. And again, it's about healing the world. We're 24 years into this story, and it's not going to end. Micah and I have learned that already. So it's a great thing. Very powerful.
We have 2 final questions. Johanna, how did your fellow students react as they learned this story? What did you witness?
There were very mixed reactions, basically. So, as I said, my history teacher, she discovered the story and she wanted to gather some students to work on this. And we sort of created a project group, so we did some research in that group and organized events and such. And at the beginning, there were about 30 students who were interested in joining this group, but quickly we were just 12 or so, and so we were a group of 12. We worked together, and we were all very interested in this story. But you know, we had a lot of classmates who weren't so interested in the story, who didn't care so much about it. I mean, they went to those 2 events we did in our school with Micha and with the other survivor. because they kind of had to go there. And when I talked to them, you know, some of them were sort of interested in the story. They didn't want to be part of the project group, but they would go to the events and listen to the stories. But then there were others who kind of make stupid jokes sometimes, or who weren't so interested, or yeah, sometimes have something negative to say about the whole project. And it didn't only come from the students, sometimes it came from the teachers as well. I had a few teachers come up to me who told me that they thought we were sort of overdoing it with everything, that not everybody had to know about this story in such a huge way, and we didn't have to put a monument there and do events and tell everybody about it. Like, if we just kept it a little smaller, that would be better. But I mean, sitting here now, I think we kind of proved them wrong. And yeah, so it was kind of sad for me to have so many classmates who weren't so interested in the story, because I certainly felt the impact and the power of this story, and I kind of wanted to share that with everybody, and I tried, but not everybody understands it, and I guess we kind of have to deal with that. But yeah, there were very mixed reactions, and yeah.
Well, on behalf of all of us here tonight, we want to thank you for what you've done. Thank you for caring, and thank you for keeping this story alive. We appreciate it. Last question. As the daughter of a liberator, how has this story shaped your understanding of your father's role in World War II? And what lessons do you draw from it about the ordinary people who became heroes?
Well, Matt has already alluded about how my dad never considered himself as a liberator. He really felt that we owed it to look at the survivors as the heroes for what they endured, for the perseverance that they kept throughout all of those years that they were suffering and treated in such disrespectful, inhumane ways. And I think out of this comes the point that we need to look at each one of ourselves inside. And earlier, I had something else all planned, and when we got to the high school principal had on a lanyard, and on the lanyard it was E plus R equals O. And Mika asked him what it meant, and he said it meant event plus response equals outcome. So I think I tied it in for the students, and I'm going to tie it in for you too. Here is a event. The train was there. The soldiers came upon it. They had a choice. They could have just gone to the battle, but they stopped and they did the right thing. And yes, as Matt mentioned, many of them had memories that were very hard for them to live with the rest of their lives, but they knew they were doing what was the right thing. So every day, and it's like you said, not the famous heroes, but every day you have a chance to be a hero. No one may even notice that you're a hero. But to that person that you have shown kindness to, that person that you've taken time to show that you care, or have extended the hand when other people have shunned them, will make a difference. And as we've also mentioned tonight, it is time for us to be doing that. We no longer can stop. We need to be thinking, how can we help each other? And remember that we have to embrace our differences and be there for one another. So, that's it. So now I'm going to ask you, Mike. You've had a number of years you've been working on this project, and I am very grateful, as well as the survivors and many of the other liberators and their families, for the time and effort you've put in. What are some of your takeaways?
I think the takeaway that I remember the most, I was in Rochester, New York, number of months ago. And as we've taken the film across the country, we've finished 3 out of the 4 episodes. And we were screening the episodes to a group of high school kids. And after we do the screening, usually I do a Q&A. And a young man in the back of the room said, "Mr. Edwards, what do you hope to take away from this story? What do you hope people take away?" And I said, each one of you in this room is going to have a train near Magdeburg moment, or moments in your life. It may not be to the degree of saving 2,500 Jewish prisoners of war, but you're going to have a choice to care about somebody or not, to love or to hate. And it might cost you something. May you remember this story. May you remember 18, 19, 20-year-old kids who had a choice. They could have gone on, but they stopped. May you remember this story that you too can be a liberator. That's my message. And that's why we're doing the project.